Welcome to the stage Dan Maffei.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's town hall meeting with our congressional representative here in Central New York, Congressman Dan Maffei. I will be serving as the moderator for tonight's event, which is focused on strengthening the middle class. As someone who directs a nonprofit in Syracuse, New York, doing work to create economic opportunities for people who are working hard and struggling on a daily basis, this is a really important topic, and I just want to really acknowledge the Congressman for taking the time out to talk to us about these issues here tonight, and appreciate offer my sense of appreciation for that. It's a real privilege to get to have a dialogue with our elected leaders. And one thing I can say, we have a lot of great elected officials here in our region, both sides of the aisle, but one thing that I've always known about Dan is his commitment to being thoughtful and having a really good dialogue on issues. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that strength of Dan and thank him for continuing that here tonight. Before we get started, this has been a difficult week, both in our own community and across our country. Very tragic event for many of us who have connections to the Syracuse University community. Rob Edson, who worked in Syracuse Athletic for many years, he died of a heart attack this weekend at home with his family, leaving behind a wife and 2 children. And then, of course, today in our nation's capital, very tragic moment at our Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. And so for both of those reasons, I'd like to take a moment of silence here right now. Aside from our wonderful quality of life is great anchor institutions, and Onondaga Community College is certainly one of those great anchor institutions. And so it's exciting to be at Onondaga Community College here tonight, and we'd like to thank them for hosting. And before we kind of hear from our host tonight, I would like to just kind of share the rules of the road for tonight's event and talk about how the format's going to work. If you'd like to ask a question or speak to the Congressman directly, you're more than welcome to raise your hand, and one of the staff will come with a microphone. We would ask that you let us know who you are, give us your name, and where you're from. And after doing that, please feel free to ask your question to the Congressman or make a comment. If, however, you don't feel comfortable speaking in public or would rather have your question be written down, you can also request a note card from one of the Congressman's staff, and they will collect those note cards from you and they'll put them in a gesture box just on the other side of the table there where I'll be sitting, and I will read the questions from those boxes. We will alternate questions from each side of the room and the gesture box as we go on throughout the event. On the note card, if you do choose to go that route, please just make sure that you fill out your contact information. And if for some reason we have a really active dialogue tonight, we'd be happy to make sure that that question is followed up on later on. At this point, I would just say, are we going to start passing out note cards now?
Well, they're available.
They're available. So if you want one of those, just kind of gesture over to the staff and they'll make those available. Before we go on, though, I want to acknowledge, again, our host, Onondaga Community College, and thank them for hosting us here tonight. And I'd also like to offer a warm welcome to a relative newcomer to our community, Dr. Casey Crable, the new president of Onondaga Community College. She brings a whole lot of experience to our community, and we're really excited about everything she's doing. And we're really excited to hear from her tonight. Welcome.
Thanks Thanks very much. I'd just like to add my welcome to your community college. We're glad to have you here on campus. For students who've taken the time to be here tonight, good for you. It's a good choice to make, to get out and learn whenever you can. We think that an opportunity to have a thoughtful exchange, dialogue, a chance to learn is really at the heart of American higher education. So we're very pleased to be the setting for tonight's discussion. I'm glad to welcome all of you here this evening. Thank you, Congressman.
And now I'd like to welcome. You guys hear? Is that what's that? And now I'd like to welcome. Pastor Darren Heine of People's AME Zion Church for our invocation.
Good evening. May we bow our heads for a moment of prayer. Gracious God, we come before you, God, this day just to say thank you. And God, we pause for a moment to remember those who have lost their lives in Washington, D.C. We pause, oh God, to remember the athletic director of this beautiful college. We pause, oh God, to remember all of those who stand in need of prayer. We ask, oh God, that you'll bless us individually and corporately, that all that we say and that all that we do will be for the betterment of our country and our society. This is our prayer we pray tonight in your name, and we say amen.
And I would like to welcome Gabriel LaChance, a Life Eagle Scout, currently on his trail to Eagle Scout, a Life Scout, currently on his trail to making Eagle Scout, or Troop 68 here locally, which is chartered by the Onondaga Hill Presbyterian Church. And of course, I'd also like to welcome the very exciting young ladies in front of us, the Girl Scout Troop 10546 from Onondaga Hill Middle School. They're going to help us say our Pledge of Allegiance here. Folks, for being here again, and I want to thank you for taking the time out of busy life schedules to talk about these important issues related to strengthening the middle class here in our country. And obviously, so many issues relate back to that core issue that so many of us feel valuable here as Americans. If you are interested in asking a question or engaging in the dialogue via the note card and have not asked for a card yet, please just wave down a staffer. They're everywhere. Anybody okay? Just also so you know, if you are filling out a question, but it's on a topic that the Congressman has already answered, then we might pass over that in the interest of keeping us on schedule. But if you do feel like you have a question that hasn't been addressed, feel free to let us know, and we'll make sure that everyone's comments are heard. Kind of just general rules of the road here, just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page. Again, I will be alternating between questions from the audience and questions from the box, should I get them. We really hope for people to kind of engage in an active conversation. I will kind of take the questions and then the Congressman will answer them. And again, I just want to thank you, Congressman Maffei, for being here tonight and for taking the time out to have a conversation with our community. And so with that, I would like to welcome our great Congressman here, Congressman Dan Maffei, and let him say a few remarks as we get started.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Look, I'm thrilled to be here, and very, very grateful to everybody for taking part, and that includes the wonderful Girl Scout troop and the aspiring Eagle Scout. One of the privileges of being a congressman is I get to congratulate all of our Eagle Scouts, and it's a wonderful little thing that we get to do. I do want to welcome everyone to their Strengthening the Middle Class Town Hall, and I do want to start out by saying that my thoughts and prayers are with the victims of the Navy Yard shooting and their families. We've been watching it all day, and you know, it always reminds you of all these past tragedies. And then it was such a shock, Rob Edson's death, the athletic director here at OCC. So, you know, we do have a bit of a heavy heart tonight. I do want to say, though, how proud I am to represent Central New York in the United States House of Representatives. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you and answering your questions and having a good discussion tonight. I do believe that Central New York is the best place in the world to grow up, to raise a family, to work, to retire. But in order to keep it that way, we need to strengthen the middle class, the backbone of Central New York. And we can do that with creating jobs and making sure the economy is going well. And that was the topic of the roundtable discussions that I had in all 4 of the counties of the 24th District. I heard from nearly 200 local business owners, the development leaders throughout. I also have been holding these Discuss It with Dan events, and those are a way to meet with me one-on-one or in small groups and share your thoughts. I've toured dozens of hospitals and schools, businesses, manufacturing plants, and I've heard from the workers. And based on all this input, we started to put together a jobs plan and recommendations to create more jobs and grow the middle class here in Central New York. And one of the key things that came out of all of this was the real importance of education. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to be here at Onondaga Community College tonight, because everyone sort of talked about how important it is that we do have the best education. We've done several panels just on education, pre-K through 12, and also higher ed. But I do want to take a moment to thank the president and the new president, but boy, you've really hit the ground running. Susan, thank you, and all of your security and technical people, and your interpreter. I really, really feel at home here. I do want to know that the solutions and challenges that face Central New York won't come from Washington, and I realize that probably more than most, having been down there, seen what's going on down there. They'll come from people like you, and that's why I wanted to have this forum tonight, because I really do want to hear what you think, and get your questions and have that kind of dialogue. I do think it's important that we go to our constituents, but we want to give you the opportunity too to come here and participate. And I want to thank you all who are here tonight, particularly for being engaged and involved, for coming to the Strengthening the Middle Class Town Hall meeting and sharing your thoughts directly with me. Now it's like a game show. Now we'll get to the questions. Can everybody hear me from this microphone? Okay, I wasn't sure. I get the...
Yeah, I think I'm back on mine. Am I better now? Okay, great. Okay. With that then, I think we'll start with a question from the audience, if anyone has one to begin with. Do we have anybody? Yes, sir. We'll start right there, if that's okay. Remember, we can tell the audience who you are and where you're from.
Hi, my name is Bill Chambers, and I'm from Baldwinsville. And I have a question. What changes in the tax code would you favor to help strengthen the middle class?
Thank you, Bill. That's a good question. There are a number of things that I think we can do. Some stuff that we've done before that we can bring back. For instance, we used to have what was called a federal empowerment zone in New York. That allowed businesses that were in the zone to hire more people and to get certain tax breaks for that. It's actually not too dissimilar to some of the stuff that Governor Cuomo's talking about, but it would be throughout the region. But I've already introduced some tax incentives. And what they are they're just things to help businesses, particularly small businesses, get a little bit of leg up when they first make investments in either things like equipment or people. And one of the things that we've put in is or I think we're about to introduce, is that we've been working on, is a tax break to help new businesses employ more people. And basically what it is it's a rebate on some of the payroll tax that they'll have to pay in. It doesn't affect the payroll tax, but it's a rebate on their income tax for that. It just gives businesses a bit more of an incentive to hire more people. Because often, we realize that, when you're hiring somebody, that's a commitment the business makes, it's a risk, but we want to make sure that we encourage that. There's a number of ways that we can do that. I also think more broadly, we need to look at our corporate tax system. And I know I'm a Democrat, but I'm for actually lowering the corporate tax rate, but for making sure that the businesses actually pay it. And if we do that, we can create a level playing field where businesses aren't able to do all these offshore kinds of tax shelters and things like that, but do have a lower tax rate. That will also improve the economy.
Yes.
Yeah.
What about tax simplification?
Well, I actually think a lot of the things I'm talking about would help simplify it, certainly the corporate side. A lot of the complexity in the tax code is not something that your average American family needs. In other words, there are all sorts of tax breaks that you fill out. But they're generally, if you look at them like, when you're filling out your tax forms, as I do, and you're like, well, am I a farm, am I this, am I that, you'll sort of see they're very, very special cases. I think we could eliminate a lot of that, frankly. Particularly if we were willing to just look to lowering rates overall, but reducing those particular provisions. It's never going to be completely simple, because in order to make it like, as simple as people want, we would have to get rid of some things that I think do make sense, like the home mortgage interest deduction. I think it does make sense for people to own their own homes, and that kind of mortgage interest, I think, is a good thing. But overall, I think there's a lot of different kinds of things in the tax code that people would rather get rid of the complexity, get rid of that specific rate if their overall taxes were a little bit more predictable and a little bit lower. So I'm generally for that. I'm a little bit, I think it's going to be difficult to pass right now, but I wrote a paper when I was out of office, and I do think that there are some indications that there might be, certainly the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, which is the committee that handles taxes, has been interested. So it may take a couple of years, but I think it's worth it. In 1986, they did something like that. Simplified it, lowered the loopholes, and I think clearly it's time to do that again.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you, sir. So for the next question, we will go to the question cards. And this is from a Syracuse resident named Michael Watt. And Mike wants to know if Congress would ever have the courage to audit the Federal Reserve.
Well, I don't know if Congress, I certainly hope so. Look, I supported auditing the Federal Reserve. I don't think there's any agency of Congress that is above oversight. Our founders created a system of checks and balances, different branches of government checking and balancing each other. And when we have the greatest abuses and the greatest problems, frankly, is when those checks and balances fail. One horrific example was the Renz case, where this man who was up on pornography charges was allowed to, the probation office, the federal probation office was supposed to watch his monitoring device, and they didn't respond to 24 months. We all know the tragic results of that are terrible. And I feel for that family. But part of the solution to that is making sure that federal probation office is in fact monitored. But the Fed is the same thing. The Federal Reserve is important, and I'm not for getting rid of it. It is important that we have a nonpartisan division that does set best economic policy. That said, though, nobody should be beyond oversight. And the basic audit of the Federal Reserve, I think, is completely appropriate. I supported it as part of legislation when I was in office before. I continue to support it. Will Congress ever have the courage? I think Congress would, but we do need to find a way to really get it passed, because, like I said, I do think that there are some out there who would rather not do that just because it's a change and we need to keep pressure.
Thank you. Over here. Oh, did I not see anybody? Okay, right there. Okay.
I signed the card because I didn't know exactly what the system would be.
Oh, okay.
My name is Bill Andrews. I'm a veteran.
Bill, can you wait till the mic gets, we want everybody to hear you.
Sorry.
And then,
Yeah.
Okay. Hi. My name is Bill Andrews. I'm a veteran. I am very concerned about both jobs and the roads and the highways and bridges of the country, which are, as everybody admits, in bad shape. There've been proposals to spend federal money on the infrastructure of the country, which would make jobs and which would actually repair some of the things that are badly in need of repair. Republicans in the past have favored this, Democrats have favored it. Why now can't we get that done?
It's a great question, Bill. You're a World War II veteran, correct? World War II? We're, thank you for your service. I'm not going to ask the veterans to stand up or anything like that, but I do want to say that the people who fought with this country, who served in the military honorably, every time we do anything that's an exercise of democracy, including this town hall meeting, I think we always need to remember that if it weren't for them, we couldn't be exercising our democratic rights. But to answer your question on infrastructure, it is one of those things which is very frustrating because there's no question that, in my mind anyway, that investment in basic infrastructure, such as things like high-speed rail or even more reliable rail, our airports, basic roads and bridges, making sure that whatever we do with Route 81, we have the resources to do it. But also water infrastructure. I don't know if anybody's noticed, but there have been more water main breaks. Shouldn't be a surprise. Our water infrastructure in central New York is decades, and in some cases over 100 years old. It's amazing that it's worked this long. I mean, we've got our money for it, but we need to do those things. And yet, it's a problem in Washington getting it through. I believe, I work very closely with Richard Hanna, who is the congressman in the neighboring district. He's from Utica. He and I toured together the Port of Oswego, for instance, recently. And he's on the committee that does these things, and he's all for it. There is no partisan divide here in central New York, in my view, on this issue. But there are forces in Washington who, for whatever reason, don't believe in government of any kind. And in the case of infrastructure, there really is, I believe even in public-private partnerships. I'm willing to be very creative when it comes to financing infrastructure. But ultimately, when you're talking about something that all of us share, it has to be, the federal government has to have a major role in it. And until we get through that impasse in the House, it's very difficult. There have been many, many people, from Arnold Schwarzenegger to former Governor Rendell of Pennsylvania and Mayor Bloomberg, all willing to work together to create an infrastructure bank, a proposal I really support. But these are investments. It's not the same thing as spending that you don't know will have a return. You're buying something of substance, a road, a bridge, a water system, that will pay dividends. And because of that, I just think it's so vital to our economy that we invest in it. So I'll continue to fight with my Republican allies, like Richard Hanna, for more investment in infrastructure, because I really think that it will have those dividends. And finally, we should give to our children and their children a better community than we have ourselves. And by letting all this infrastructure fail and go downhill, eventually it's going to cost them far, far more to replace it, to undo the damage, particularly environmental damage, if we don't fix our water and sewer system, than if we didn't do it. So, we should do it. And I really thank you for it.
What are the prospects?
I've got to be honest with you, they're dim in the near term. In the last Congress, they were only able to pass a 2-year stopgap bill, when usually you did a 6-year back when I was for Senator Moynihan, and he was powerful on the Transportation Committee in the Senate. It was a 6-year bill. These are kind of projects that you need some time to plan, so a 1-year or 2-year bill doesn't work. Central, for instance, they really need a longer bill so that they can plan and make sure that they have the resources and to have the fleet and can plan where buses are going to be needed. But I wish I could tell you it's going through, but right now it's very, very challenging to get anything that involves the government at all through the Congress, again, even if we have broad bipartisan support in large areas of the country.
Let's go back there. We had tap up the mic here, but we can recover.
Hi, my name is Karen Rigney. I'm from DeWitt, New York. I agree with you about the government role in infrastructure, but it's also protecting the middle class from financial abuse. So what do you propose, how do you propose to protect the middle class from banking abuses? Are you for regulating?
Clearly what happened, and I think this is the anniversary, the 5-year anniversary of the kind of the worsening, serious worsening of the banking crisis. Clearly, that was a disaster, and there are lots of people to blame. But the lack of regulation, of really having a level playing field with referees, was part of the problem. That problem has been addressed. I'm not saying fully addressed, but it has been addressed. In the 111th Congress, we passed the so-called Dodd-Frank bill that was able to bring some sanity to it. Now, it's not a perfect bill. In some places, I know of local businesses, for instance, local investment firms that have had auditors for a year picking out these really little things. And in my view, that's not what, they're kind of wasting their time when you have these big banks that are still getting away with a lot. So we do need to continue to improve that. I am concerned about particularly over speculation and things like commodities and that sort of stuff. When people are pumping up and putting down the price, and for no real investment reason other than sort of placing these sort of these bets that don't have any real financial underpinning. So there are some areas that we need to take a look at. It does get very complex though, but we're working hard to do that. And I'm supportive of both reforms to sort of help smaller businesses deal with Dodd-Frank regulations, and also things to more put it on the larger banks. I've even been told that the larger banks are working really hard lobbying the regulators themselves to put more of the regulation on the smaller guys. And again, I don't think that works. So it's a very good question. We are still working on it. I'm not on that committee anymore, but that's okay. In fact, in some ways, it gives me more freedom to work on the issue in a very independent way. But it's still a big need.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Okay, we are going to go to the cards real quick, and we have two from Robert O'Connor, which I think can be delivered pretty succinctly. And they're really asking for your voting positions, or predictive positions on any amendments to block the Affordable Care Act, to serve to block the Affordable Care Act, and then also your stance on the farm bill, the nutrition-only farm bill, which could cut $40 billion from the SNAP program.
Well, let's start with the farm bill. First of all, let me make it clear that I do think it's very important that we pass legislation to help our farmers. It's easy to sort of say, oh, farms, they get so many subsidies and they get this and they get that. But the fact is that many of those subsidies have been cut long ago, and the kinds of farms that we have in upstate New York, mostly fruit farms, a lot of dairies, some organic farming, there really isn't anything that's a giveaway for them. They work very, very hard to feed us all, and they're actually a very important, an increasingly important part of our economy, particularly our tourist economy with wineries, etc. There are really good provisions that I think are important to them, some of which were included in the original House version of the Farm Bill that was passed the Agriculture Committee. For instance, a price stabilization program for the dairies. And they're now in a worldwide market, so you have a certain number of cows, and then suddenly the market might change, and there's got to be a stabilization program. It's impossible for any farmer to weather that. And it's so important to keep our dairies, because when you have a shortage, you really need them. And so we need to make sure we do that. Another program is there's a lot of stuff to improve organic farming and to make sure that organic farmers aren't left out of some of those kind of programs that help make sure that they can make the investments in capital, etc. Immigration is part of it. That was not included in the Farm Bill. We can talk about that later if we want. But what happened was, unfortunately, and again, this is not a majority of the House, and it's not a majority of the Republican Party. I know there's a lot of partisanship and people blame one party or the other, but there is a certain faction that stripped out a lot of these good provisions, put in some others, and in the end, that made the Farm Bill fail and lost. So they came back with a bill that they were able to get almost no Democratic support on because it cut out the what's called the nutrition programs. These are programs, food stamps is the one that everybody's heard of, but there are a number of programs. And they actually help farmers because there's an additional market, but they help people by providing, you know, basic, it's called food stamps, it's now on a card. And look, and I've heard, you know, you read on the internet issues of abuse, and I'm not saying there aren't any, but that doesn't mean you should throw out the whole plan. The food stamps allow people to eat. And in a country like the United States, we can do this, we can afford it. But this plan came through Congress, again, without some of the other stuff that was needed, and so I voted against that bill. I think the Senate has the right idea. The Senate kept them together, had a compromise bill. Both Democrats and Republicans supported it in wide numbers. I'm hoping that we can follow more of that, and I've been pushing for that. And I've talked to farmers. We had a meeting with farmers a few weeks ago, and you know they need these provisions, and it shouldn't be held hostage to any politics in Washington, either the Democrats or the Republicans. So I'm hopeful. I certainly think a lot of the people dealing with the farms on a daily basis on the Ag Committee will help push it forward. But again, I mean, everything is falling into what's going on in Washington. On the issue with the
Affordable Care Act.
I want, yeah, no, this is important, so I want to be clear. I supported the Affordable Care Act, but not without reservations. And I realize that's the worst kind of position you can have, right? It's like a yes or no. I do think it can be improved upon. I really do. And I think there's a problem on both sides. Too many Democrats, even though they know that things might be likely flaws, they want to just say, well, we shouldn't make any changes, we should just implement it as is, even if there's ways we can improve it. Too many Republicans, they don't even want to give it a chance. They want to just repeal it. Again, I'm generalizing. This is not all Democrats, not all Republicans. My view is that we shouldn't start over. We've seen how hard this is. We need to start somewhere. But we should make improvements where we know they make sense. So I oppose any attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act. But when something comes up, like the president said, we'll give a year longer for businesses to meet the mandate that they insure all their, or make sure their employees are insured. And we said, well, what about families? I said, fine. We should let families have another year too. It's just another year. It doesn't, in my view, derail the whole bill. In fact, I think it'll be stronger for that. But I got a lot of criticism from Democrats on that. All right. But I am for not repealing the whole thing. And in fact, I think before you think about repealing the whole thing, remember things like insurance kids up to age 26. Remember things like making sure that you can't be turned down for a pre-existing condition. There are provisions in this bill that are very, very broadly supported. And at the end of the day, I think we should work with what we've got in the real world. Then it may not be perfect for anybody, but at least it's a start. Thank you. Of course, Bob.
Thank you. I have talked so much about...
Actually, Bob, can you just wait for the microphone gets on?
I'm Robert O'Connor from Fayetteville. Dan, I'm not talking so much about throwing out the whole Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, but things that we've heard, like cutting some funds for specific things like the healthcare exchanges, which are getting ready to start next month so that people who have either poor or no health insurance can get something starting in January, and we'd like to see that continue since we've gone this far and spent a lot of money to get ready. And there are millions of people, as you know, that have very poor or no health insurance.
That's a good point, Bob. I mean, let me make it clear that there are some things that have been proposed. Just because I will certainly look at any change, you know, that's put forth in good conscience. But it doesn't mean all changes are good. For instance, I voted against a measure that would have made it harder for people to qualify for lower income families and smaller businesses to qualify for some of the assistance that's in the bill to help people get insured who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford it. I don't see, that's, part of the important part of the bill is to make sure that people can get insured. Is that because, not just because we want to help poor people who can't afford it, but because if people come to the hospital and they're not insured, does that mean they don't get health care? No. And I think very few of us would truly want them to not get health care. It means we all end up paying for it in higher bills. So the more people we can get insured, may take a couple of years, but the more people we get insured, the lower all of our payments will be. So yeah, a lot of those changes that were that are geared to, to taking some of that away, I oppose. I look at each one of them. I try to consider what constituents write in, particularly if they're writing in about that particular change. I heard a lot about from particular building trades. The electricians, the brotherhood of electrical workers, and the plumbers and steam fitters, and people who build our buildings, because they have particular kinds of healthcare plans that are a little more complex because they have different employers throughout the year, and they ask for this year delay. So I thought that was a productive change. But something that really changes the bill entirely, I'm not for. And try to differentiate. Thanks for the
Okay, we'll stay on this side of the room. I see you first hand up here.
My name is Andrew. I'm from Syracuse, New York. I suppose I'm backtracking a bit about the Affordable Care Act. And you had mentioned yourself that it's not a perfect bill, of course, but you'd like it to stay generally the same. I was just curious that if it is such a beneficial bill, why did Congress vote to opt out of it themselves, to abide by the same programs as the rest of Americans?
I really appreciate actually you asking that question, Andrew, because this has been going around the internet a lot and in various places. And indeed, there were versions of the bill, several years ago, versions of the bill that did not apply to Congress. But I specifically co-sponsored and pushed provisions that made sure it did apply to Congress. And the actual bill that was passed, the law of the land right now, applies to Congress and their staffs. And in fact, my staff and I will all go into the exchange, just like everyone else. So I understand why that people could, get that impression, and I've seen this on the internet and on other places myself. But it does apply to Congress.
Thank you. All right, going back to the cards, then we'll work our way back over here. So this is a very localized question from Will Sutterth in Syracuse. With the entire New York State Senate and Congressional delegation co-sponsoring your Harriet Tubman National Park bill, what is the next step to passing that through as legislation?
Great, thank you. And actually, I meant to thank Reverend Darren Jaime, who was here earlier for the prayer. He has been a strong supporter. It's his church, the AME Zion Church, that actually owns the Harriet Tubman House, and it wants to give it up in order to make it a national park and share it, frankly, with the rest of the country and the world. And so I meant to appreciate the question. Yeah, look, unfortunately, this is a bit of a long process, but we're getting through it pretty good. We do have all the co-sponsorship of everybody in the New York delegation. We have major members of the committee that handles these issues. The way it's done is they usually have a couple of these parks bills go through at once. I don't think we'll see, I wouldn't expect to have seen anything before we get past some of these budgeted passes and stuff like that. It has nothing to do with the Harriet Tubman bill. Doesn't add to the deficit because it just comes out of the parks budget that's already exists. But nonetheless, it unfortunately, just like anything else in Washington, it is sort of stuck behind the block. But once that's resolved, we've already had hearings in both the House and the Senate. I think the prospects are very good. It doesn't mean that we can give up or we can sort of say this is going to be easy. I've seen a lot of things, unfortunately, with broad bipartisan support fail. Simply because Congress didn't get to it one way or the other. But I just remember what Harriet Tubman said when she was working the Underground Railroad. One of the key things she always would say was, keep going, keep going, keep going. It did help that she had a loaded gun in her hand when she said this, but she meant it also. And so persistence, I think, is a very important part.
moving to this side of the room, we'll start in the front here.
Oh, you? I see him. My name is John Goody. I'm the head of an organization called 40 Above Workers in Transition. And we are growing rapidly, which leads to my question. What can be done for the long-term unemployed, particularly mature workers, which is a growing number? We have people like, we even have a nurse practitioner. We've had respiratory therapists come in. We've had IT managers, supply chain managers. What can be done to help these people who are either unemployed or underemployed? And it's a serious waste of talent.
Yeah, I agree, and I appreciate your organization and working on finding the time to come and talk, share ideas specifically with that organization. And I'm thrilled that it exists. I do. I think older workers can offer so much. I mean, you think about the kind of experience, that they can teach younger workers, particularly, that sort of trade-off and mentoring. There's a lot of potential that addresses some of the issues that we've heard in the business community. Even just, learning workplace, basic workplace attitudes and skills and things like that, how to deal with other people. So I do think it's a horrible waste. There are some things we can look at in terms of doing things like job fairs and other kinds of things, opening up networks. Certain kinds of job training, maybe senior workers have the knowledge base, but there's some new computer program or something like that. The truth is, the only real way that's going to really help us get this fun is to have more jobs. I mean, because there's plenty to do. I think we all know there's plenty to do in this society. But we're being held back by a sort of lackadaisical economy still, even in the midst of the recovery. And a lot of businesses who, and it's hard to blame them, are saying, we're not sure we want to make these investments right now. The improvements are good, but frankly, I think right now they're being held back in part by this federal government that can't even schedule a vote on keeping itself open, and some of the programs. And also what we talked about earlier, lack of investment in basics, infrastructure, education, things like that. I think those would go a long way. And then finally, I do think that there's a lot in central New York in particular that could be brought to bear. And again, I want to come and discuss some of these things. There's a growing tourist industry in central New York. Well, these aren't hugely high-paid jobs, I think. But I think a lot of older workers would love to be sort of tour guides, to use some of their knowledge. There are opportunities like that. Not that hard. But I, you look at something like the Seward House in Auburn, and people who run that work there, gives a tremendous opportunity. My grandmother was a docent at the Everson for many, many years, and she enjoyed that. Now, I'm not saying that that's the be-all and end-all, but I do think that there's some particular things in central New York. I do think some mentor programs are very good. You might want to look at getting older workers more involved in the business incubator, the sandbox, there's all the stuff down at the Tech Garden. I think that might be another good opportunity, sort of business entrepreneurs and also teaching. But I want to listen to more ideas.
Thanks for the evidence.
Yeah, of course.
No, I just wanted to leave this with some explications about organization. We're nonprofit and we are not government. We're just people helping.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Okay, we will hear now on the card from Sheila Fenn in Camillus, New York. And somewhat related topic. The unemployment rate is higher. What's doing to reach out to unemployment?
That's true. It is higher, and it's a horrible tragedy. And interestingly enough, I do talk to a lot of businesses that specifically want to seek out veterans. So there is a bit of a miscue. Some of what we do try to do is improve the network. I'm very, very fortunate that I have 3 wonderful military veterans that work on my staff, and 2 in central New York. And they do a lot of outreach to both veterans organizations and particular veterans on those things. And we're also working very closely with the Syracuse University and a program up there that's sort of associated with Syracuse University, but also private. It also has its own funding. That has an entrepreneurial boot camp to it. And this really helps veterans, both largely aimed at starting their own businesses, but it doesn't have to be. They can also start nonprofits, or they can work in other businesses, but it gives them that kind of training. And there's a big emphasis on that. So that's not my office alone, but we're working with them to try to make them stronger and to increase their outreach. On this, look, any idea, I mean, I met with a business leader that has a new business idea that would involve veterans in a major way. We're looking into ways to help him. It's not quite ready to be announced yet. It's in the private sector. I think the key though here is like in many things is for my office to work with the private sector. My office and the government generally is not going to solve all the problems, but what we can do is be partners with the private sector. That's what we've done, and I think we can do it more. And actually we've had a fair amount of success, particularly with the veteran issues, because there's clearly a lot of interest in the business community. Like I said, a lot of the stuff that we heard from the business community in these listening sessions were essentially that that businesses are they're having a hard time finding not necessarily the workers with the particular skills, because they're sometimes willing to train that, but with the kind of particular attitudes. You know, we're bringing up kids, and unfortunately with all the television and media, we're not necessarily teaching them basics, like, you know, how to get along with people, how to be there on time. They're not bad kids, but they don't necessarily have this kind of training. And veterans, because they've been in the service, usually do. So a lot of businesses are actually looking for veterans. So we're going to continue to try and make those connections.
Great. All right, we'll shift to the side of the room and go right there in the here we are. Oh, we're right here.
I'm Janet York. I'm from Marcellus. I was listening to Elizabeth Warren this morning explaining some of the problems with banking. And she said that there are, I can't remember, 4 or 5 major big banks that are getting some interest breaks to get money from the Fed. And that this is hurting small banks. And I think when you're talking about helping small business, and I think small business is what's important to Central New York, since we lost all the big corporations, that we, you know, what do you think can be done to help the lending? There seems to be a lack of money being available to lend to small businesses. And I think it's part of the problem with the Brookfield Glass-Steagall and with the post the big crash, helping the big banks, but not helping everybody.
Yeah. Well, we talked a little bit about this earlier. I do agree with you. And certainly in Central New York, I guess I can't speak for the whole country, but I suspect nationwide, but certainly in Central New York, it's small businesses that are the big engine of job growth. Large business, look, I'm fine with large businesses. I'm not going to say that we shouldn't have them or anything like that. But by and large, and not completely, but by and large, they're contracted. It's the small businesses, particularly entrepreneurial businesses. Here we have a lot of engineering firms and architecture firms, design firms. These are the companies, and high-tech manufacturing. These are the companies that are hiring more people in Central New York. And, you know, sometimes you can get a little bit depressed because you only see, you know, so-and-so, Lockheed Martin lays off 150 workers or something. You're not going to read necessarily, unless you really read the business section closely, that this small company hired 2 workers, this small company hired 3. But it does add up. So I think you're absolutely right. There's a couple of ideas I have. I mean, one thing is that, you know, again, I think some of the reforms that were necessary, that sort of stop the bleeding, if you will, do need to be adjusted. That, as I said, I think larger banks are manipulating some of this, that because they have these huge compliance departments, they're saying, oh yeah, regulate us in this way and that way, but you got to regulate the small banks too. And these community banks are getting socked with huge new regulatory burdens. I mean, it's interesting. It's like, you know, we need to have basic regulations, but we also need to have some basic common sense. I think credit unions can be a part of this. It's interesting, a credit union just opened a branch here at OCC last week. And credit unions are very limited to how much business lending they can do, partly because the banks don't want them to be able to lend more, and partly because they weren't considered business entities. They were supposed to be more for individuals and families. But so many of these businesses are family businesses. I think that could be raised, and a lot of them are doing a lot of lending. It's the smaller banks and credit unions that know their customers, and they know when it is a good risk or not. And so they will tend to lend much more. Another idea that I have, and this actually gets back more to the first question we had on tax breaks, that we did introduce a bill, and this isn't exactly on banking, but in terms of helping small banks, that will allow people to put aside money tax-free, kind of like they would for retirement, but in order to start a small business, or to contribute to their own small business. I'm not saying that idea alone is going to solve anything, but I think that would work. In terms of getting to Glass-Steagall and some of those other reforms, I do think the world has changed since the days when we had pure separation. I'm not sure if that's practical. I know it would be hard to pass politically. That said, though, I think we can look at some. You focus on the 4 biggest banks, and that's really the problem. You get the very, very tippy top, and they do have privileges that no other banks have in terms of being able to borrow. I would like to see a few more strings attached to those privileges. Not necessarily more of a regulatory burden, but maybe a certain quota of small business lending they have to do, something like that. I'm not set on any of those ideas yet, but I'd like to explore them further than that. Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. Back to the card, and then we'll go back over there. No, I know. Syria seems, this is from Liz Steinberg in Camillus, and she says that Syria seems like a no-win situation. Have the recent UN reports and other intelligence given us a deeper idea on what our position should be or what we should do?
Syria seems like a no-win situation because it is a no-win situation. I'm privy to, on this topic, I am privy to some top secret stuff and briefings, but I can tell you that there's really nothing in any of that changes the overall look of the situation. Yes, Assad has many, many faults, and it's deplorable that he or anybody would use chemical weapons. That said, though, the opposition, many elements of the opposition are worse, and some of them, frankly, are Al-Qaeda, the same people that bombed us on 9/11. And there's a lot in the press right now, in the media, about how, we can just help the good rebels and not help the bad rebels. A lot of people I've talked to who really know the situation on the ground there don't believe you can differentiate like that. There might be good people and bad people, but we don't necessarily know who they are. And trying to get something, so putting more arms in, bombing, all of those things, even if they're justified, even if we have, he did this chemical weapons thing in international law, blah, blah, but it won't necessarily have the outcome that we would like. Our intentions may be good, but humanitarian bombing just doesn't make sense to me. So I'm glad that the administration is trying to work out something on the diplomatic level. I'm not saying the Russians can be completely trusted either, but they have in their own interest trying to limit these chemical weapons. Frankly, if those chemical weapons were to become loose, they would be more of a danger to Russia even than us. So, one, I do think that it's a free country. People are certainly welcome to criticize it, but I do support the president's efforts to work something out with the Russians. And two, no, Syria is in my view a no-win situation. We should try to help the humanitarian side as much as we can. Refugees are going to become an increasingly big problem. We have allies, Jordan, Israel in the region, other things that we can maybe try to help through. But involving our own military, and even if our own troops are not at risk, and I don't know how you would do it without our own troops not being at risk at all, but even if they weren't at risk, I still not convinced that would actually help the situation. And that's where we are. It is an evolving process, and I'm going to try to keep both myself and you as constituents updated as much as possible. But I think we really got to hope that this diplomatic solution works, at least to the chemical weapons. And the last thing I'll say on this is that we shouldn't be unrealistic, though. Just solving the chemical weapon problem doesn't mean peace in the region. This is still
completely war-torn country. There's a lot of tragic things going on there. And again, it's not that I don't want to stop them, it's not that I don't feel we might be justified in trying to stop them. I'm not sure military means will stop them.
Thank you. We're going to go right there on the aisle. Yes, sir.
I have one. Okay. My question has to do with education. I've worked in education the last 30 years, from middle school to college level. It's my understanding that strengthening the middle class involves education, growing the middle class. But I've seen the No Child Left Behind. I've seen many, many, many children left behind. And looking at your memo today, I look at the Student Success Act and where that stands, where we're going to lose $1.3 billion for education. Again, I would include in this, if we do go to war, there'll be less money probably for education, but cuts to staff teaching, opportunities to learn and to be able to reach these kids more effectively. And it just seems to me that with the food stamp effort, which is equally valuable, can be affordable, as you said, and you also said the problems won't be solved in Washington, which scares me. But I just feel that somehow we've got to find a better way to get the K-12 kids prepared for college level and to work in middle class.
Yeah, actually I might have pre-K through 12. My sister's a pre-K teacher. The more studies we do, the more we learn. The earlier and earlier we can get the students, the better. So I want to include pre-K through 12. But first of all, I want to thank you for your service, your educating people, particularly the middle school part, but all of your teaching service. And I mean, you know, teachers, if teachers were, you know, paid as much as I think young people really value them and how I value my teachers, we'd all be millionaires. But that's beside the point. That's not why most teachers get into this. So let me just say, though, that I do think that we've had a real problem with our federal education policy. First of all, I do feel that education is a national responsibility. It has been left to the smallest form of government, the school district, often a town or maybe half of two towns or something like that. And here we are, and not just for the kids, which is very important, or for the teachers, but for our economy. We need to have some national standards, but we also need to have national resources and a national investment in what we all know is the future of our economy and our country. And that, you're right, No Child Left Behind. The one good thing about it was the name. And it hasn't lived up to it. Right, so you know, here I am criticizing the Bush administration. Well, guess what? The Obama administration came in, it's not much better. In fact, the one thing that was good, the name is the only thing they changed. Now they got raised to the top. It's the same thing. It's too much imposing standards from above. Yes, we should have a national education policy, but it doesn't mean that one size fits all. And that's increasingly what this is. And it's taking federal education dollars and it's basically saying, okay, well, since we don't have very many federal education dollars, we're going to have competitions. And this state and that state and that state, you all compete. But it isn't even like the students and how they do, or it's certain kinds of policies that make sense for some parts of the country, but may not make sense for others. And yet, if you don't fit the mold they want, we're going to start cutting your funding. And so even though New York is a race to the top state, the lion's share of the funding we're not eligible for simply because of the makeup of our political system or what have you. And I would submit to you that students should not be held responsible for that. That students should be held, and that we should have an education system that is not playing favorites. So I've been very critical of the Bush administration. I'm sorry, of the Obama administration. I've been very critical of the Obama administration's education plan. I don't think it's particularly good. Now I've seen a little bit of hope when the president was here. I think we talked about higher education, making it more available to the middle class, particularly making sure that funds are available for students who want to do public service, making sure that, we already passed legislation on this, but that students can will not have to pay more than a certain amount of their income That's good. We need to apply some of those standards to pre-K through 12. I was pleased that he complimented the Say Yes program, but I'd like to see more done in the administration to help programs like Say Yes that are trying to make strides, but frankly could use a few more resources to make sure that the students do this. And then the last point I just want to talk a little bit about is you mentioned student nutrition. And I do say, there are people who, I understand, they say, well, people should take personal responsibility, and that's why they're not for food stamps, or they think we should cut food stamps, or whatever. And although I may disagree with that when it comes to food, I see the point. But where I don't understand is when people want to cut out student lunches. They're basically saying, these are kids, but it's the kids' fault if their parents don't feed them. And it's foolish, because in the end, it's these children that are all of our future. And you can't learn on an empty stomach. And so these are the programs that I do think pay off great dividends in the long run. Getting student lunch, student breakfast, that may be the only nutrition some of these kids, unfortunately, my sister told me in her class's case, only nutrition they get in a day. So that's at least one thing that we can do for them. Let's not even cut that. Thank you.
Can I just add quickly that it's rather ominous that the No Child Left Behind has been replaced with the Student Success Act.
Yeah.
Which now is
My name is Richard Gillespie. I'm from Syracuse. Dan, I'd like to comment on something you said earlier and have you expound on it. I'm a little concerned about it. You mentioned that you might support the idea of lowering the corporate tax rate. Now, as you know, years ago, the rate was perhaps even twice the rate it is today. I think it's somewhere in the range of 35 to 39%. It was up in the 80s or more, perhaps, at one time. And business did quite well over the years. CEOs make money hand over fist. So if we're lowering the tax rate on corporations, and there are needs of this country, and they have to be met, doesn't that put the burden on the average taxpayer then to pick up that loss of potential revenue?
Richard, it's a good question. I appreciate you bringing it up, because it does sound a little counterintuitive, right? You want to lower the corporate tax rate, but you're a Democrat and you believe we need resources to do basic things. The issue right now with the corporate tax is that it really is no good for anybody. It does create some real disincentives for business, because the rate is, relative to the rest of the world, very high. And I think some of those rates you're talking about were more individual rates for very, very, very high earners than corporate rates, but I'm not 100% sure. But relative to the rest of the world, we have now the highest corporate tax rates in the rest of the world. So there is one problem there, that whatever we would like to do, or we think we should do, we exist in the rest of the world. It is a worldwide trading system, and we do have to compete on that stage. But the problem isn't just that. No one pays it. I mean, you read these stories about General Electric paying no taxes. Well, the reason is because, yes, we have this very high rate, but there's so many loopholes, so many ways to get out of it, particularly for these international companies by shielding or using tax havens overseas. You see these Bermuda, they'll set up Bermuda companies, etc. So it's really not just that our tax code, that the tax is too high or too low. It's outdated. I wrote a whole paper on this for a group called Third Way, which is sort of a centrist democratic group. Anyway, you can get it online. But the point is that what I'd like to see is go ahead, yes, say to businesses, okay, we will lower the corporate tax rate to be more competitive with the rest of the world, because we don't want you to move overseas just to get away from high taxes in the United States. But we're also going to get rid of a lot of these loopholes, not let you shelter this money, and believe it or not, that will raise more money. Right now, even when the rates you say with the rate we have now, we're raising far, far less money than we ever have in the corporate tax. So just raising the rate, unfortunately, in this world today, I think would end up creating a bigger problem, because more and more businesses would move overseas. Lowering the rate, but making it universal. You can't get away from it. It's a basic thing, but if there's a level playing field. It's not, we're not going to charge you too much, but it's a level playing field. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Okay, from Bill Chambers, from Buell. Bill would like you to explain how Dodd-Frank has helped the class.
Well, when we had this banking crisis first about 5 years ago, And a lot of these banks had offered a lot of these products, and I say products, but we're talking about mortgages and loans and things like that, where people would qualify for certain kinds of mortgages. And they would be very happy at first, right? I didn't even think I was going to qualify for a mortgage because I had this credit card, that or that, and they qualified for a mortgage. Well, turns out, though, that what looked like a good thing at the time may have been a very bad thing, because the mortgage was not sustainable for many middle-class families. And the only way it was going to work is if the property values continued to go up and up and up and up forever. And what happened? Eventually, property values didn't go up, because that's the way the world is. We actually had less of a problem in central New York, in part because we didn't have the big real estate boom, so we also didn't have the big real estate bust. But it was even a problem here. As houses, you buy a house, you take a mortgage on it, and you have a down payment. And a lot of these banks had these very, very low, sometimes almost no down payment. And when the houses went down in value, suddenly the amount of the loan was worth more than the house. This is just one example, but it was one of the biggest examples of how this crisis happened. Suddenly people started defaulting on these loans, losing their houses. The big banks couldn't collect the money, and the whole system collapsed on many, many, many middle class people. What we need to do is make sure this didn't happen again. Make sure that, yes, the banks couldn't offer products that didn't make any sense at all, or that had some sort of a gimmick in them, where the fine print hid the real issue in it. And Dodd-Frank did a lot of that. And we had another bill called the credit card bill, which went through at the same time. Credit card holders' bill of rights that also did a lot of that. It made sure that, okay, one, we're going to get rid of these products that are truly what we call predatory, truly, there's no way you can really get a good deal from them. But most products, we're not going to do that, but we're going to regulate them, and we're going to make sure the consumer knows what they're getting. It did a lot of that. Today, you open your credit card statement, it's different than it was several years ago. That's true when you get a mortgage, there's different kinds of requirements. And sometimes you feel like, well, why do I have to fill out this piece of paper? But the piece of paper is there to protect you, because it ensures that a big bank can't be pulling the wool over your eyes. So it has done some of those things. But as I brought up earlier, there's still a lot more that needs to be done. It's still too confusing. You shouldn't. You may need a lawyer to buy a house, but you shouldn't need a lawyer to get a credit card. So there's a lot of stuff that we still need to work on. And in fact, and as I said before, there's burdens on small businesses that were actually too onerous, although most of those aren't from Dodd-Frank, but we're trying to work on all of those too. So, there's still a lot of areas.
Okay, so right there in the orange.
I promise I'll be a little shorter in my answer.
All right, I think we have time for two more questions from the audience. You and
Hi, I'm Matthew Klang. I'm from Liverpool, New York. I want to thank you for taking the time to meet with us today and having the town hall. Back in March, I read a report that was in the Times about Citigroup lobbying the House a lot for changes to Dodd-Frank, like with HR 922. And one of those bills you actually voted for. The Dodd-Frank Act, as everyone knows, put in place requirements that bring some level of transparency to the derivatives market. This June, you voted for HR 1256, the Swap Certainty Act, and which Wall Street wanted. And it exempted foreign divisions or subsidies of U.S. banks from regulation and oversight on derivatives. Basically, it opened up loopholes for them to continue to do a lot of the shenanigans they did before the financial crisis with derivatives. Many of the major financial scandals involved with derivatives have involved these types of trades conducted through the entities like I mentioned. Why did you vote for HR 1256? It's something I kind of would have expected your opponent in the last election to have voted for. Not you, and as a supporter I was really disappointed in that. Basically it helped Wall Street, not Main Street. Could you explain your vote, please?
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously I disagree with that to some extent with the analysis, because but I understand where you're coming from, because that was the original reason for those provisions. At least the intent was designed to do that. Unfortunately, I think the provision was missing the mark. First of all, you were still getting a lot of derivative trading, but it was going on overseas. So what was happening is these banks were basically just doing the same thing for the same customers same, everything was the same, except for now it was being done overseas where there was no watchdog. And it was likely going to happen a lot more. So the problem is that without a rule that's forcing the banks to keep everything there, you were getting that sort of Wild West kind of thing. So I understand where you're coming from, and I agree. On first glance, you look at it and you go, well, Maffei is voting to ease up either regulation. But really what we're hoping to do, or I was hoping to do, and I'm not going to pretend I'm right 100% of the time, but was to make sure that we had decent regulation, which there are lots of provisions of the Dodd-Frank bill, this is why I disagree with your analysis a little bit, that do continue to oversee these things. But it wasn't so prohibitive that it was going to force, basically, these banks would keep doing it, but now do it overseas where U.S. regulators couldn't look at it at all. Is that, sort of like settling for something? Maybe it is, but it would have been both bad for our economy in terms of jobs in the financial services industry, and I believe worse for the regulatory structure if we left it in there, but all these banks kept on moving those overseas, just having these overseas divisions do it, then it would be outside the structure. So, but I'll admit that it wasn't, like many things, and I should say this, unfortunately, the way Congress works, particularly, you get your choice is yes or no. And that's fine, and that's what you elect me to do, and I appreciate you can tell me. But on so many issues, that you want to say yes but, or no but. On this issue, I had to come down one way or the other, and I believe that it was better to take away this provision that was, again, had a good intention but bad result, in my view. That said, there are other areas, of course, that I've continued to, there are other areas where I've voted to strengthen Dodd-Frank and opposed other changes. So, I could be wrong, but again, I weighed both sides and decided that this was probably the better. It does, the big banks were for it. I'm not going to lie about that. But so were a lot of little banks because there's various levels of derivatives, and some are more complex than others, and there are different industries, et cetera. So, I try to make the best one. Thank you for the question.
Okay. We'll go right here, depending on the...
I feel bad.
How quickly we get through it.
People are likely to stand to go over a bit. I know my answer.
Okay. Go right.
My name's Josh from Syracuse. Thank you. Thanks for coming, Dan. Unfortunately, our country's still at war with a certain war, which all of us are not really it's not in our face anymore, but the drug war. And the drug war's been going on for over 50 years now, maybe 70 years. What would you say, in your opinion, would be to help reform our drug laws and help reform our minimum mandatory sentencing to help improve the middle class from falling down on themselves and having no other choices left?
That we continue to look at, so I appreciate any of what they have. But look, we can look at, let's just look at the outcome. It's been 50 years of the drug war. Drug use isn't down. Drug abuse isn't down. Deaths from drugs aren't down. Yes, more and more people are sentenced to with drug crimes, but that's still in our jails. It's not necessarily improving the situation on the streets. So I will say that largely the drug war has failed. If its intent was to get rid of illicit drugs. I think we need to look at a much different approach. We need to concentrate on the violent criminals, the drug trade, and in terms of users, I think we need to look at an approach where we may not necessarily legalize things, but instead of sending somebody to prison, we want to send them to therapy. Get them off their addiction if they're addicted. Make sure that people have the treatment they need. I have supported making sentencing getting rid of some of the mandatory minimum sentencing, but it just doesn't make any sense. Again, for nonviolent crimes, there's a discrepancy between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, and somehow, if you're wealthy and you can afford powder cocaine, you go to jail for less time. That doesn't make any sense to me. Again, I think we should emphasize the treatment if it's nonviolent, if somebody's using, but we certainly shouldn't be unfair there. And I worked when I was in office the first time to voted to equalize those sentences to make sure that those were less. So again, the Rockefeller drug laws, which is a lot of mandatory sentencing, it hasn't accomplished what we wanted it to accomplish, if that's what we wanted to accomplish. I think we need to look at these things in very new ways. So I don't have like a platform or whatever yet on this, but I will. But I'm very confident in criticizing the current system. I don't think it's where I think it's spending a lot of money, and God knows we still have a lot of gangs on the streets of Syracuse, and they're fueled by a drug trade. So if there's some way that we can figure out a way to lessen that, I think that will have better results in the long run than the current policies.
Thank you. All right.
Also, parenthetically, I'm for medical marijuana. I don't see why, if we have doctors can prescribe all sorts of amphetamines and other kinds of things, because that's for medical use. That's fine. Why would marijuana be different than that? And I think it's absolutely unconscionable that the federal government would tell a state that they can't legalize.
Great. All right. Last question, all the way in the back, sir, on the aisle. Yes. Yep. You.
Yeah. Okay. I was looking for the microphone. Sorry. My name is Victor Lenny. I'm from Syracuse. So I just want to bring to your attention, back in 1996, in the mid-90s, there was a company, institution called AmeriCorps that was basically instituted by President Clinton. Under President Bush and even under this administration, it's totally non-existent. And AmeriCorps right now, I think, would be probably a good institution to reestablish and basically give it a stronger mission. Especially right now when we're dealing with a lot of cash-strapped cities. AmeriCorps, basically, I mean, right now people are talking about, well, we don't want government involved in anything. Well, sometimes government's good when it can partner, when it's able to partner. And the government has done well in partnering in other venues such as like the National Guard, where the federal government and the state work together, and the National Guard's been very successful to the point where we have National Guards serving throughout the world. Okay, it's been very successful. But with AmeriCorps, by being non-existent, we could, right now, not even having to spend any new money, but utilizing the money that you have right now with the, by taking some funds from the Labor Department, Federal Labor Department, from housing and urban development, and even from agriculture, and basically funnel that money and go to places such as maybe like Syracuse and say, okay, you have projects that are on your board right now, but you can't spend the money. So let's us bring a certain amount of money, you bring a product, we'll basically employ some of your people in your neighborhood. And then this way here, it's money that can be measurable because everybody's bringing a piece of the puzzle together. You can employ people and then get those people back into the arena so they can be viable consumers, viable taxpayers, viable product and service providers, and not only that, make it possible for people who are like retired, who have skills, who are unemployed, to bring them back in and train these people, and also give our young people a sense of service. Right now, our young people have no concept of service right now. So what's the chance of you bringing that to the president and say, let's bring this back up. Let's make AmeriCorps what it was supposed to be, the Peace Corps for domestic issues, and getting it going here. So.
Thank you. I think you laid out the case extremely articulately. So since you asked, the chance is extremely high. I would love to bring that idea. I've supported national service for a long time, for a lot of the reasons why you say. I think young people, should have a sense of involvement, and there's something bigger than themselves. And it is an issue with unemployment, and there's so many things that need to be done. And the expense is small, as long as, particularly if you can leverage the labor from all these young people who will be working for not all that much pay, but there's so many things that need to be done that are not being done at all. But it's not that we're paying somebody a good wage to do that, and now we're going to take their jobs away. They're not being done at all. There's so many things. I think about homeland security. I think about all sorts of different civic things. I think there are a lot of needs. AmeriCorps still exists. You're right, it's been cut a lot. I'd like to look at, and I did when I was first in office, but I'd like to pick up the attempt to actually have an AmeriCorps in Syracuse. There are a few AmeriCorps volunteers here, but they're actually out of the Buffalo office. So I'd like to look at that. But I think you're absolutely right. Wesley Clark proposed a national service plan where everybody would have to do some national service. It also has the advantage, by the way, of making sure that there are some non-economic, that it's not just going to be, kids who really need the money for college joining the service. Although I've never seen anybody in the service who didn't also, really want to serve their country. At least the individuals that I've seen. But I do appreciate the fact that if everybody had to do something, that it would probably be a more equitable way of getting military service too. You wouldn't have to do your service in the military, but there would be some incentives, maybe less time or something else like that. But everybody would have to contribute somehow as they're growing up. I think it would be great. So I think that's a great point, and I am going to bring it up with the president. And it's really, and this is part of the frustration, I guess, is that I think it's so difficult to be president, and I'm not sure if, and I think anybody who criticizes President Obama or President Bush before him should keep in mind that these are people making tremendous sacrifices. But I do think that there are some real opportunities, hopefully in this president's second term, and I will be encouraging him to sort of push the envelope a little bit on some of these things. Wouldn't it be great if we could have an AmeriCorps-like service restored? I think it would help restore some of the soul of America too, to have young people engaged in that and not just playing video games or whatever. Nothing wrong with video games, but have some sense of purpose bigger than themselves.
Great. Okay.
Anyone else?
Well, you know what? Dying to ask a question. I have seen the gentleman right on the other aisle. You right there. You have been very anxious. So if we could just keep it short out of respect for everyone's time. Yeah. Yep. All right.
This will be the last one.
All right.
My name is Will from Syracuse, and my question is a little different from his. I'm more concerned about how the issues of mass incarceration in the current judiciary system being addressed in relation to strengthening the middle class.
Yeah, no, and actually, it's a huge issue, and partly it's because of the so-called drug war, mandatory sentencing. You do have a lot of people in jail, but partly you have a system that, frankly, doesn't give kids anything to do, and if they don't have anything to do, some of them are going to get in trouble. And part of the challenge there is we just have to get more jobs for people. And it's interesting because I actually think that these last three questions, I couldn't have scripted them better in the sense that because we do have kind of a choice to take. We can kind of take the pessimistic choice, if you will, well, nothing can be done to fix people, and if you grow up and you don't have good parents and you go bad, there's nothing you can do, and we're just going to put you in jail and that's it. Or you can take the view that we're all in this together, and that every child, no matter where they come from, should have a shot at being in the middle class. And that was what makes the economy stronger and what makes us all stronger. And so instead of, if you can get funding for things like pre-K, school lunches, those investment funds, pre-K through 12, things like Say Yes, and get kids, and they don't have to all go to college, but get kids interested in a career. I think you're going to be able to, and doing public service, you're going to be able to really change the dynamic. Give kids, any kid should get a second shot. I really do feel that way. America is the land of the second chance. Pat Moynihan always used to say that. All the people I've worked for said that. But you've got to make sure that, that if they come meet us halfway, we meet them halfway, and it gives them other things to do. We can't afford to continue to have more young black men in jail than in school. And I don't think we can't afford it for the African American community. We can't afford it for the entire community. Because that's our workers. That's our workers of the future. That's our economy. That's the underpinnings of it. And so we continue to be penny wise and pound foolish, and we're going to cut this plan because it's just after school basketball or whatever. Well, maybe there are some places we can cut, but let's not throw away the baby with the bathwater. Let's make sure that we do invest in basic education, basic training, getting kids nutrition, making sure that they can be mentored, getting treatment, you know, when people go awry. I think it's a much better world. And I think it'll pay dividends in the economy for the much longer run. It's not just government's job, the private sector's got to be involved. Families got to be involved. We've got to involve our families more. There is no magic bullet here. But I do think that even my office in Congress can be a part of this, and certainly the policies I support. So I really appreciate that question. Yes, it's a disaster the way it is. Look, I represent Auburn Prison. Auburn Prison is always going to have prisoners. So we got to do whatever we can to reduce the prison load, because there's always going to be, unfortunately, that's the way human nature is. But the way we're going right now, filling up our jails, investing so much in incarcerating us to somebody when you so much less to educate them, it just doesn't make sense. Again, it's penny wise, pound foolish. And with that, I want to just thank everybody again. This is an important town hall meeting. It's an important part of democracy to get this dialogue going. We're going to continue to do all the other things we do, the discussions with Dan, and et cetera. But I want people to know how appreciative I am and how good the questions were. Really very good, very educated questions. I wish and hope that the answers were as good as the questions. I fear they weren't, but I'm very, very proud to represent you, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Thank you very, very much.
Again, thank the Congressman, and especially for going a half hour past the scheduled time. Thanks for taking a lot of time and for being sick too. Really, the staff will be hanging out to answer more questions if you want to engage further. Plus, we'll save all the questions that weren't asked tonight.
I want to let you know that I have a
sorry
nephew
we couldn't get all of them. There's contact information on
working for American Bar in Montana.
Thank you, everyone.
For the last
Thank you.